Ladies and gentlemen, Agwina Ushla, you're very welcome, and you're most welcome to this online embassy event, the second in our series of Centenary conversations marking key moments in Irish history and the wider history of these islands. Today's discussion will focus and explore a new book, The Dead of the Irish Revolution, written by Eunan O'Halpin, Professor of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity College in Dublin, and Dr. Daithí Ó Corraín of the School of History in Dublin City University. We're delighted to have Eunan and Daithí joining us this evening to discuss the book with Dr. Caoimhe Nic Dháibhéid, who is Senior Lecturer in Modern History in Sheffield University. The Dead of the Irish Revolution is an important book, meticulously bringing together for the first time a chronology and a narrative of all those who lost their lives during the revolutionary period in Ireland from 1916 through to 1922. This account of the lives lost from 1916 on gives us a fresh insight on how the events of the revolutionary period in Ireland unfolded, and most importantly, where and on whom they impacted. It assigns a name and presents a human face for each of the 2,850 individuals, both civilians and combatants, who lost their lives through political violence during this turbulent and transformational period. For instance, it tells us that 100 years ago today, on the 23rd of February, 1921, 7 people were killed as a result of political violence in Ireland. 1 civilian female in Donegal, 3 RIC constables in Dublin, another RIC constable in Bandon, County Cork, and 2 members of the British Army Essex Regiment, also in Bandon. 3 of the 7 fatalities were in retaliation for previous killings. The book also tells us that in the period between 1917 and 1921, responsibility for fatalities was pretty evenly divided between Irish revolutionary forces and British military forces, including the police. The book is also very interesting on where the violence was concentrated. Somewhat to my surprise, the grim statistics show that the 5 counties with the lowest rate of fatalities were in Ulster: Tyrone, Cavan, Fermanagh, Down and Donegal, while the highest 5 were in Munster, in ascending order: Kerry, Limerick, Clare, Tipperary and Cork. In fact, County Cork accounted for 24% of all fatalities in the period from 1917 to 1921. So, as well as giving us a lot to reflect on, this important book will be a key source of reference for historians for many years to come. It helps illuminate the events of a century ago, gives us a deeper understanding of the context of the time, and a better appreciation of the different perspectives on this revolutionary period, both now and then. In this year of significant centenaries, it is right that we pause to reflect and commemorate. As Minister Simon Coveney said last December, let us acknowledge our common history and deepen our shared understanding of it. Let us respect the diversity of our memories and perspectives. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Caoimhe Nic Dháibhéid to commence this evening's conversation.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. I have my copy of the book here. It's a very weighty tome, but lots of opportunities to immerse yourself in the types of meticulous detail that Eunan and Daithí have assembled and put together. So I'd like to invite Eunan to say a few words, then Daithí, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. Just to members of the audience, we very much welcome your comments, your questions. Please, you can use the chat function, so add your questions or comments in there, and after Eunan and Daithí have had a chance to say a few words, we will have that discussion. I will put some questions to them. So Eunan, would you like to begin?
Yeah, just briefly, thank you, Caoimhe. I'd like to thank Ambassador O'Neill in particular and his colleagues Fiona Flood, Fionnuala Callanan, Kate MacDonald, Isabel O'Connor, Nicola Murphy, and no doubt others for putting this together. I'm doing this on behalf of myself and Daithí. I know the pressures, we both all know the pressures that the Irish Embassy are under and will continue to be. And just to secondly say this is a piece of Irish history, it's also a piece of British history, and it's a piece of British family history and military history, just as it is of Irish. Thank you.
And Daithí, would you like to just say a couple of words to begin?
Thank you, Caoimhe, and hello, everybody. This book would not have been possible without the generous help over many years of numerous libraries, archives, museums, volunteer researchers, descendants of those who died, and of course, Yale University Press. Eunan and I are profoundly grateful for that help, and it is a great pity that circumstances do not permit us to thank you individually, or indeed to thank you in person this evening.
Yeah, I went through the bibliography and I noted there were 55 archives across 3 different countries, which is a phenomenal achievement and a phenomenal amount of work clearly that has gone into it over years. We're going to invite Eunan and Daithí to introduce some of the themes of the book before I give a response, and then we'll have some time for questions. So Eunan, what are the themes that stand out to you when you kind of step back from the big detail of those individual casualties and fatalities during the War of Independence? What sticks in your mind?
Well, I think one thing that Daithí O'Neill has flagged is we use the county because it's the default unit of measurement, and it has its huge problems, but it's also it's a big attachment to county history and so on. Is the variation between counties, and one can't help looking at then and the more recent troubles. And as the ambassador pointed out, to have this extraordinary thing where Tyrone, measured by population, which we're all used to now because of COVID, to come out as having the least fatalities, for example, is extremely interesting. To have the Ulster counties generally with such low numbers, I think it is. I don't say it's challenging, but it's not something certainly that I expected. I think that's the first thing. The second thing, in some ways, for me, is a technical thing. The enormous number of military casualties, which are what the British Army call own goals, is just astonishing. And most of them weren't suicides. Most of them are reflecting the fact that you have very young, poorly trained, raw, untrained children. The Chief of the General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, termed them. You have very low quality military material, but they all have weapons and they're loaded all the time. And we sometimes forget that most Irish volunteers never got to fire a shot in the War of Independence, partly through circumstances, but partly because their weapons were so few and so varied. I think that's very striking. What's also striking, and again, I didn't know this, was that civilian casualties, not the absolute number, but responsibility for them, because I was probably reading back the more recent troubles onto the 1920s. And in terms of civilian casualties, what stands out there's 2 things. One is the high proportion of civilians whom the IRA kill are deliberately killed as spies, and that's for a wider debate in some ways. And the distribution of dead spies is extraordinary, because while there's a very high number in Cork, a high percentage as well as absolute number, there's none in Antrim, there's none in Belfast. I mean, what's going on between those 2 places? But the spies is what sticks out for me, the civilian casualties. The other is the large number. I think it might be 200 out of 919 civilians from 1917 to 21 who die. They die at the hands of Crown forces simply for failure to halt when ordered to do so, which is, I think, or for attempting to escape. This is an enormous number. And again, if we read the more recent Northern Ireland troubles, all the issues about green cards and cautions and things, getting on for a quarter of all civilian deaths are where soldiers or police, mainly soldiers, in a sense, could fire with impunity and with very poor training. About a dozen of those civilians, it turns out, were simply deaf, right? So you've got this disability coming in. You get some women, probably females or girls, dying that way. So those are things that didn't. I just had no idea, and in some ways I think it's a vindication of research that you come up with things. On the margins of this project, I published an article based on the death registers about unknown infants who appear in the death registers who aren't part of this. They weren't killed as part of the political violence, but they're oddities that emerge. So I've constantly been surprised, not just by the individual stories and so on, but by as I say, by the unexpected. Thank you.
Thank you. Daithí, what are for you the standout themes from this?
I suppose the very obvious one, and that's the human cost of the Irish Revolution. There's been a tendency, I think, in terms of the revolution to focus on the well-known events, the 1916 Rising, the Solohead Beg ambush, Kilmichael, and so on. But what we've tried to do is different. We have looked at things chronologically, day by day. And it's worth bearing in mind that from late February 1921 until the truce in July 1921, there was not a single day when somebody, and usually several people, did not lose their lives due to political violence. So I think establishing an overall figure is very important, but also collectively understanding the individual stories of all of the dead of the Irish Revolution. So all of the ordinary men, women, and children, the rebels, and the members of the Crown Forces. It provides us with an immeasurably richer and more informed, if extremely somber and stark understanding of what was a very turbulent and troubled decade.
Seems to me that's one of the major achievements, isn't it? Rescuing from, I guess, the shadows or the margins, these victims of the revolution who are often just feature, if they feature at all, as statistics. And here we have their names, we have the circumstances of their deaths, we have in many cases an illustration of the intimacy of these killings and these losses of lives, how one death and one attack can precipitate another. There's a lot of vengeance going on here. So you can kind of, each entry, if there's a related death, that's flagged at the bottom of the entry. So you can trace these little paths through the revolution and follow them back and forth, which is, I think, extremely interesting. I know that, of course, one of the big trends in the historiography of the Irish Revolution has been the dominance of the county study. And you've kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, Eunan, when you were talking about how the county is just the basis for our measurements. It's what we're all used to. It's how many Irish people think of their own identity. And you've sort of used that in your tabulation of statistics towards the end. But I wonder how you think your data fits with what we know about the county as a basis for interpreting the Irish Revolution. Daithí, you co-edit a series, don't you, with Four Courts Press, looking at county studies and kind of building up that picture for every county in Ireland. So has the data that you and Eunan have compiled, has that changed your understanding of how the county functions, do you think?
Not particularly, because the dead of the Irish Revolution addresses a particular set of questions. The Irish Revolution County series by Four Courts Press addresses a different set of questions. It is primarily concerned with what life is like for ordinary people at a local level during this extraordinary decade. So what are the trends politically? What are the trends in terms of the suffrage question, female involvement, unionism, and so on? And what we found in terms of the county histories is that every county is very, very different. So for example, Antrim, which is the next volume to appear, that is where the Irish Revolution is not successful. It is very successfully defeated. In Roscommon, the major concern is land. It's not the national question. It's not the achievement of a republic. It is increasing the size of your holding. The two projects complement one another very well. Obviously, the experience of death, the experience of injury, the destruction of property have very serious consequences, not only at an individual level, but also at a local community level.
I'll mute myself there. I suppose that's quite a major addition to our understanding then, that different counties experience different types of political violence, whether it's focused on property, whether it's focused on land seizure, whether it's focused on the kind of sectarian warfare that characterises Belfast in 1920 and comes back again, which we might get onto in 1922 in particular. So it's quite one experience in one county it's quite different, and we should be maybe sensitive to disaggregating that picture in more carefully, I think. One of the other, alongside these kind of hidden stories and forgotten people who you're rescuing, I suppose, and bring back into the spotlight, of course, then you have also brought more detail to some of the more well-known figures and deaths of the revolutionary period. And I know you have a particular interest in Kevin Barry, to whom you have a family connection. Would you like to talk a little bit about the Kevin Barry case and all the deaths associated with the Barry case and what you found out about it?
Okay, well, that's my other book, Kevin Barry, An Irish Rebel in Life and Death, which came out last October. Yeah, I have a family connection, and in some ways I've grown up with this kind of overhanging me, as it overhung to some extent all my mother's family. And some years ago, another book, 1989, was published about Kevin Barry, and it was the first time I saw him as a real person rather than as some kind of plaster saint. And Barry's case became one of the, so it's on the checklist of names that would be known in relation to, there's a song which you can, like chewing gum, you can't get, it just sticks in cultural memory and so on. But when you explore his case a little, it's very interesting. He ticks boxes for the international market, to be cynical in propaganda terms. He's a medical student, which means there's a lot of kind of social and economic capital associated with him. He's a student, which is a designation to do with radicalism and so on. Although Kevin, his politics didn't come from his time at UCD at all. He's young. The photographs of him that were circulated, mainly in wearing a hoop sports shirt, speak of a bright young fellow, just like thousands of young British public school boys and Oxbridge men who went off and had just been slaughtered in the First World War. So he has a big international register straight away. Well, what's very striking for me as my mother's son and his grandnephew, is there wasn't a mention in that family, well, hardly a mention of my other great uncle, Paddy Maloney, son of a Sinn Féin TD who was killed in Tip in May 1921. My grandfather, Jim Maloney, lived till 1981. So he lived all the time with Kevin Barry practically being in his marriage, and yet his own dead brother Paddy, Captain Paddy Maloney, was never mentioned. I think that's because of memory and because of custodianship of memory, particularly by my very dominant grandmother, Cathy Barry. And it's also, though, about, in some ways, the famous get remembered more than do others. So I think that was important for me. Can I just say also, because the military service pensions records are so valuable, are released in stages. It was only in October 2019 that I was able to get my father's papers were released online. And there I found him stating that an IRA raid he'd led in County Down in 1920 had led not only to the shooting of a clergyman by accident, they thought he was a policeman, but to his death 2 years later. The family version I'd heard was that they shot the guy, but they were relieved that he didn't die. Here's my grandfather saying in the early 1940s, he died 2 years later of the wounds. So now we have a dead Church of Ireland clergyman, as it were, to add to the family list. And I think it's about the unexpected, which can be the unexpected within a family as well as within the revolution. And can I finally say, I was contacted some years ago by somebody in Essex trying to trace a dead great uncle who was a policeman who'd been killed outside Tipperary town with 3 others. And I replied kind of cheerfully, and I'm sorry I did it this way. Oh yeah, and my grandfather set up that ambush. And here's the details of the thing. And I can see why she didn't reply to me, because she didn't quite see it probably in those terms. And there are British as well as Irish dead, and there are British as well as Irish families. Even with Kevin Barry, 3 young soldiers, one was 16, one was just 19, one was just 20. And they died, and they left families who mourned them too. And I think and I'm sure Daithí would agree, the great advantage of a universal approach, as with McKittrick's lost lives and the recent troubles, is you put everybody goes in and they get equal weight. And I think that's an achievement. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the weighing all those deaths equally, I guess, is an important kind of part of what President Higgins has called ethical process of remembering. I noted in the cases of the ambush in which Kevin Barry was captured, you noted that the soldiers who were killed there had enormous public funerals in Yorkshire, where they were from, those young men. And it strikes me that, so many of the war dead of British forces during the Great War, of course, didn't have funerals. They were buried where they fell, in many cases on the battlefields or close by. And so for society to have funerals come back to England covered in the Union Jack, to have, you know, military funerals and all those honours alongside it. That must have been quite an emotive set of experiences, I guess, for these small villages who probably would have sent, you know, countless young men off to the Western Front. And here you have in 1920, you know, this kind of continuing stream of bodies coming home. I wonder if I could ask, this is a question has come in and it's something that struck on my mind as I was thinking about going through this book. Daithí, I want to ask about sort of the process of research. I know this was a long time in the making, and obviously in the last kind of 10 to 15 years in particular, the amount of material in relation to the Irish Revolution has, you know, we've had a great array of releases. We've had a lot of digitized material being released, which has transformed our understanding of the period. But, you know, it's sort of a tsunami of information that you can get sort of swallowed up in. How did that affect the scope of the project, the process of doing the research, the organization of the material that you found? Can you give us an insight into that?
Well, I suppose if I can answer the question by starting with the most difficult category to research, and that was civilians. So 42% of the overall fatalities in the book are civilian, and typically they're not recorded in personnel roles as police are, and indeed as military attestation books. So that was quite difficult. I mean, we were fortunate, I think, that the census was digitized during the lifetime of this project. We were fortunate that the Bureau of Military History was digitized, but many of the newspapers, which are an incredibly valuable source, were not digitized. So that was a particularly challenging aspect of the research. I suppose one of our underlying principles was to ensure that each individual entry was put together on the basis of a wide variety of sources. So there had to be corroborating evidence. And we've also done our best. Now, we haven't been 100% successful, but we've done our best to render accurately personal names, to get dates correct, to get occupations correct. And Eunan mentioned the value of the military service pension collection. It is particularly valuable in terms of finding the correct age and personal names of the Republican dead, because typically their parents are seeking compensation, and parents are going to know the ages of their children and spell their children's names correctly. Compensation records were also valuable, particularly for civilians, and trying to uncover detail about the civilian dead, particularly during the 1916 Rising, because they were the largest category by some distance, but the category about which we knew the least. And finally, Caoimhe, I suppose, and again, Eunan makes this point very clearly in the introduction to the book, we're pretty certain that we haven't covered everybody. So new victims of this period will come forward, and we're looking forward, in fact, to engaging with people on this. There are all sorts of categories that we didn't include. People, for example, who died due to medical conditions which were worsened by the time, and so on. And these are difficult categories to pin down. So these were some of the challenges, I think, that we did our best to overcome.
I mean, there's going to be an ongoing project, I guess, not only in terms of additional material coming to you, but individuals and family members coming forward, and, as you say, making cases for people who've been omitted through no fault of the authors, but just through the enormity of the task that this project represented. But of course, then there's also the big question of what happens 31st of December 1921, you know, which would include the period of the Civil War in the Free State in the first place, but also the period in which there was high levels of violence in what became Northern Ireland, or what was Northern Ireland at that point, of course. And I wonder, do you have plans to do a part two? Can you speculate? Would those county statistics start to look a bit more different if you can get to, say, I don't know, 31st of December 1920? Eunan, do you have a view on what the future might hold for that project if you can have a second volume?
Well, you need to get some money for a start. I think would be a big thing. I think that the north, what's now the north, would be a huge part of it, because it's plain that one of the problems that I think we addressed by ignoring it was partition. You know, somebody who gets shot in Ireland in County Down after the Government of Ireland Act comes into operation, you shouldn't be separating them from the narrative of the 26 counties, as it were, and what becomes the Free State. And I think an all-island approach is the only way to do it. Plainly, it also facilitates in that period the reality that a lot of the violence, not only whether it was in the north or whether it was in the south, or whether it was before or whether it was during the Civil War, occurs obviously in Belfast a lot, along the border a certain amount, and in sporadically in different parts of this jurisdiction, starting with Dublin. I actually don't have I can't hazard a guess at civilian deaths in the period from January 22 to say to the end of 24, but I suspect that the majority of them fall in the north. You have a lot of killings in the south which are kind of unexplained. You know, people don't stop shooting, as you say, on the 31st of December and then wait for the Civil War to kick off, you know, like a football match on the 28th of June 1922 in either jurisdiction. I can think of I think it's in Tyrone, a Jewish peddler is killed because they think he's a spy. I think he has a Polish name, I can't remember now, and so on. So there's quite a lot of disorder generally, and I think that phenomenon we forget. Can I make one other point about counties? It's not to say, if you take a county like Cavan, which I've spent a bit of time in with an uncle of mine from Monaghan, and Cavan has a tiny number of deaths. It has one sort of big engagement at Lappenduff, in which just one man dies, one IRA volunteer from Belfast. But you know, in some ways, the memory of the War of Independence and of that period is probably as strong in Cavan as it is in other counties, which in terms of the body count were much more violent. And that's partly because the contending forces were still there. They mightn't have been fighting each other, but the police are there. You've this very intimidating, the auxiliaries, but particularly also the Black and Tans and so on. You've got British military, and you have the IRA in varieties of forms. So I think President Higgins earlier today was talking about the destruction of creameries, which as a kid I never even paid attention to, reading about the War of Independence. But the destruction of creameries strikes at the heart of a rural economy in a locality, and so you don't need lots of bodies for political violence, whoever's responsible, to have a big impact and to have a lasting impact and to impact on the politics of a place. And I think that's a message to some extent that in relation to British conduct, it's not just that, for example, blowing up houses as official reprisals was in British eyes much better than doing it unofficially, but you're still destroying people's homes systematically. And you know, you're giving them no notice and all that, and so don't expect people to thank you afterwards or immediately to be reconciled to the great project of United Kingdom rule.
Thank you. There's lots of questions coming in. I'm going to try and put some to you, group them together a little bit. There are some questions about overall pictures that are emerging. So there's one question which has come in: which county suffered the greatest loss of life overall across this period? And in your opinion, what accounted for this? Would either of you like to hazard a guess?
I'll take that, Caoimhe, if I may. The answer is actually very straightforward. If you look at the 1916 to 1921 period, it's Dublin, and largely because of the 1916 rising, when you have 505 fatalities, all largely, not all of them, but the vast majority concentrated in Dublin. If you look at the 1917 to 1921 period, as the ambassador mentioned, the county which is out in front is Cork, where you have over 550 deaths, followed by Dublin, which is about 360, followed by Antrim, and then Tipperary and Kerry.
Yeah, and it's also if you do it by population as well, Cork 1721 comes out as suffering the most deaths per 10,000 or whatever.
I mean, as a Cork person, I know how large the failure to mobilize during the Easter Rising sort of loomed in the minds of Republican forces, and certainly my reading of how the Cork IRA are mobilizing and reorganizing themselves in 1917 and 1918 is to try and kind of shake off that badge of shame, for want of a better word. But do you have speculation? Is it to do with, I mean, why is Cork so much more violent than Dublin, for example? Is it to do with, you know, local initiative being taken? Is it to do with, you know, the balance of forces, where you have high numbers of Republican forces alongside a kind of heavily garrisoned county as well? Can you speculate on why you think one county might be ahead of another?
There are many reasons. I suppose two obvious ones in respect of Cork is the size of the county, first of all, and you have large concentrations of police and British military. So in that sort of situation where you have an active IRA, which it was, there are more opportunities for engagements. There are other reasons. Terrain is a particular reason. IRA men with British military experience would be another, but they would be some of the more obvious reasons.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, there's two factors. One is Dublin had taken a hell of a beating in 1916, and not just, as it were, the volunteer movement, but the wider city and so on. I think that we have to bear that in mind. And the other point is that, which is about control, which is that the underground government was in Dublin. It wasn't anywhere else. And the underground general headquarters, which attempted with varying degrees of success, but with some success in some ways, to control the campaign nationally, was in Dublin. And I think there was probably a bit more control on Dublin operations as a consequence, because it wasn't a matter of carrying out some perhaps questionable action and sending a report to Dublin, by courier, or smuggling it up 2 or 3 days later or a week later. It was Dublin, you were much nearer to GHQ and so on. And it's clear that GHQ under Richard Mulcahy, some people may think that almost the GHQ had pretensions to being a sort of imperial general staff, but they certainly tried to manage the conflict. There's no doubt about that. And it was easier to manage, I think, and to control things, which I think is why Dublin relatively have so few civilian spies being killed, because they're under the thumb and under the eyes of GHQ in a way that in particular in Cork, and in particular in Cork number 1 brigade, they're not. And that Cork number 1 is not telling Dublin really very much of what's happening.
I mean, this sets up quite nicely a question that came in from Felix Larkin, who you both probably know. And Felix congratulates you very heartily on the book, fantastic achievement. But he expresses a little bit of concern about the use of the term Irish military in the tables, and that this implies a greater cohesion among rebel forces than was the case. And as we've been discussing, so much of the action in the War of Independence was on local initiative with only nominal cover from GHQ. And Felix goes on to say it also implies more control of the military by Dáil Éireann than would be the case in a regular army. So, I mean, he holds his hands up and says he's not sure what an appropriate alternative term might be, perhaps rebel forces, but you opted for the term Irish military. Was that a kind of deliberate decision that you were taking? Or
I think the best term? If you accept that there's a revolutionary government from January 1919, now of course we start before January 1919, then I think it's legitimate, and it's a useful omnibus term to say Irish military, and it's also for comparative purposes, if you like. I think it's useful to, if somebody's looking from outside, I think it's easier to brand them as Irish military than, I don't know what Daithí thinks, but we couldn't call them just IRA or just Irish volunteers, coming them on, even there's and so on, the Fianna. But what do you think, Daithí? Sorry.
I'd make a distinction between the tabulations at the back of the book, where space is at a premium and where we needed some sort of a term that would cover a variety of organizations. And I think the important point is that in the entries themselves, we indicate precisely what organization is involved. So whether it is the Citizen Army or the Irish Volunteers or the IRA, we break it down, and we do likewise with the police in the actual individual entries. So it's really, Felix, to answer your question, I think you're spot on, I think, with your concerns. It's really just a shorthand that we used for convenience for the tabulations.
I think it's worth saying you can also challenge us on using the term Crown Forces to cover the Dublin Metropolitan Police, because I'm tired of saying these are a metropolitan force, they're a borough force, they're like, the Birmingham Constabulary or something, whereas they aren't directly, in other words, in the control of the Crown in quite the same way as the national force, the RIC, except in Dublin were. And Belfast Harbour Police, I think there's 2 dead Belfast Harbour policemen in there. So, but Crown Forces, for the reasons Daithí said, in the aggregate, I think it's a reasonable term, just as Irish military is.
And while we're on the question of disaggregating, have you any sense of what a disaggregation of the category of civilian victims would look like? Particularly, we might be talking about by age, by gender, perhaps also about ethnicity, if we're thinking about victims from the traveller or the main care community. Any sense of what that disaggregation might tell us?
I'll let Daithí in a minute, sorry. In a sense, the straightforward one is gender. I think in terms of victims, we can tell how many female fatalities there are, right? I mentioned the oddity almost of deafness as being a factor, which is obviously a factor in any of these civil military things, but I had never given it any thought. And clearly people with disabilities also, I think some alleged spies and 1 or 2 friendly fire deaths are people who are profoundly damaged by war service and so on. But I haven't sort of done the calculations on average age or on ethnicity. Daithí might have thoughts on this because he's general editor of the county series.
I suppose I can answer the question about children. If you are to take all children from infant until 15, and the age of 15 is what's generally used in compensation terms to indicate that you still have a dependency on your parents, you're looking at a figure of the mid-90s in terms of the number of fatalities. I wouldn't classify people who are 16 years and over, and I've had some light-hearted arguments with Joe Duffy about this. I would not classify them as children because they are working. The vast majority of the fatalities are male. So only about 4% are female between 1917 and 1921. It's a little higher during the 1916 Rising because of the nature of the violence in Dublin. Women account for about 20% of the fatalities. Ethnicity is not something that was very obvious from the material that we examined. We have tried to provide information on denominational background and an indication if people were born overseas as well, to where exactly they originated from.
It's worth saying as well, sorry, on the British side, and there's a big problem with for example, mainly with British soldiers, and to some extent Black and Tans, we know so little about them beyond what's in their records. Their records are often quite complete in terms of the spelling of their name and their ages and addresses, but we don't know their family narratives. We don't know, that unfortunate connection I mentioned with the lady in Essex whose great uncle was killed, whose name was Buntrock, or another great uncle was wounded in the same thing. We don't know how those stories have lived and died and come and gone, particularly probably because of the First World War and the Centenary. There's probably more families now looking at what happened to great uncle Joe or so on, and you'll find that he may have died in Ireland or whatever. And in some ways there's a problem of sources also relating to, for example, on the one hand, you have people who now even seem rather boastful about, who they killed for Ireland and things like that in memoirs or even in the Bureau of Military History. But on the people who killed for Britain, and I would say also on the loyalists who killed to defend their community as they saw it, there doesn't appear to be the same well of either of oral sort of family memory or of writing it down. I mean, if you want an IRA pension, you end up writing quite a lot and people end up quite a lot about you. If you're a British soldier who dies or a British soldier who kills people, there isn't the same impetus or pressure to explain your actions, to glorify your actions or anything. So people like the auxiliaries who relatively kill a lot of people, they don't, do you see what I mean? There isn't individual memories in the same way, or if they are, we haven't been able to find them. There's a few things in the Imperial War Museum, a couple of things in regimental museums, but there's very little reflection on if you like, on the side of Crown forces, not only as to their service in Ireland, but in a sense who they killed and why. And that's and any kind of justification of it. And I think that's a big gap and a big problem for us in understanding why people who otherwise appear to be perfectly commendable in many ways, but why they're willing to go beyond the law very often, and who regrets it and who doesn't, you know.
I mean, I know amongst the many archives that you consulted were British regimental records, but having looked at some during the Great War, you know, in connection with some work that I was doing, I mean, they're quite bald, aren't they? They're quite, I mean, they're working material. You don't get the sort of the level of detail, as you say, Eunan, that you get in the Bureau of Military History or even in the pensions file. Daithí, was that something that you noted, that different types of sources were giving you different levels of material or different types of insights?
Yes, but I think just to come back to the point you raised about the regimental museums, it largely depended on the regiments, and I'm very pleased to say that there were really fruitful relations between this project and the Essex Regiment Museum and the Sherwood Foresters, so two of the most high-profile, well-known regiments during the period. And there was a really helpful exchange of information. I was able to supply them with detail from Irish sources, and they were able to supply me with detail from regimental sources. And some of the regimental newspapers, regimental journals, and so on, were a very rich source in terms of how soldiers perceived conditions in Ireland. I mean, they are forever giving out about the weather, but they often comment on conditions. And they're also very valuable diaries in some regiments as well. So it largely depends on how well resourced particular regimental archives and museums are, what sort of amalgamations occurred in previous decades to those regiments, and where the records went.
I just add to that, there's a kind of a technical issue to do with deserters from the British military, because it's clear, particularly in Cork, that a number of soldiers who were deserters, or who tried to pass themselves as deserters. The IRA killed them in some cases, killed them and buried them, and they haven't been found. And for example, in the Cameron Highlanders, in what's now their regimental museum in Inverness, there's, from one battalion, there's something like 22 deserters listed who don't seem to have been found. Do you follow me? And sometimes, so I think there's more work to be done in that kind of area. But there is also, as Daithí says, you do get magazines and things which reflect very often quite disparagingly on the Irish people with whom they interact. But I suspect that's typical of wherever you're going as a soldier, particularly if you're there in a sort of in aid of the civil power, you're going to look down on the grubby natives and the people who are shooting at you.
You know, desertion is one potential euphemism, as you said, Eunan, for having met something of an unfortunate end during the revolution. Shot while trying to escape, that's another euphemism, isn't it? Refusing to halt when called to stop. The detail behind some of these euphemisms comes out in the courts of military courts of inquiry, which I know was one of your sources that you consulted. What's your sense of how those euphemisms functioned, both in terms of dealing with suspected or known IRA members, or also in terms of covering up perhaps civilian deaths?
I think they certainly once the military take over the administration, as they do much of Ireland, through courts of inquiry. On the one hand, they create records which, since Daithí was looking at them and I looking at them later, are now Find My Past or Ancestry, or both for all I know, have them up there in WO35. But the military, I mean, there's plenty of difference. If it's a young male, any age between 16 and 60, which is still young to me now, the army is not going to, least of all a court of inquiry, by the unit who's responsible for the killing, they're not going to worry about that. The only cases where they worry is where females are killed, where there's more of an effort, because females would definitely not have been seen as competent in any circumstances. But the courts of inquiry files are interesting because they are so well ordered and so organized compared to coroner's inquests, which are very hard to get to, and they generally don't exist. But on the other hand, as you say, the military, it does, in many cases, it's a euphemism. Now, having said that, the military kill I think there's about 7 or 8 British soldiers are killed for failing to halt, because typically they're trying to get back into barracks, having been out drinking or something and they hop over the wall. There's 2 soldiers killed in Galway in one incident, because you must remember the sentry, who's probably 17 if you're lucky, the one thing he knows is the sergeant has screamed at him and screamed at him and screamed at him. You fire one shot to give a warning, or you give 3 warnings, but you say stop, and you fire. And so it isn't simply for covering up, if you like, unlawful killing, but it is often the case that that's what it is, especially trying to escape.
It's worth bearing in mind, I think, as well, that in terms of police who are prosecuted for killing people out of hand, one of the most striking findings of our research was that just one policeman, a guy called William Mitchell, was executed in June 1921 for murder in connection with an aggravated robbery in Dunlavin in early February 1921. He's the only one. So several, generally things may go to trial, but soldiers and police are nearly always acquitted.
But it's worth noting as well on that one, funny, the killing of Mr. Dixon, the person who Mitchell killed. When I read this killing first, I thought, oh, here's a Wicklow killing, which is very unusual. Secondly, he's a Church of Ireland. I think he's a synodsman. He's a local dignitary. He's friendly with the police. So it's obviously an agrarian / perhaps IRA killing. It turns out to be done by two Black and Tans who had just arrived in Wicklow in Dunlavin. They'd arrived the day before. They obviously got drunk and went out robbing. So sometimes you have to be really careful about saying, making assumptions in individual cases. And Mitchell got hung. There were a few more were sentenced to death, Coburn and somebody else from Abbey Leaks. But they beat the hangman because of the truce, as of course did a lot of Republicans.
Just a couple of more reflective questions, I suppose, that have come in. One is to ask you your view on how, if at all, this material is taught in UK schools, which you may or may not be familiar with, the extent to which the Irish question features in history, in the teaching of history in the United Kingdom. And you mightn't be as plugged into the current debates in the UK as those of us who live here are, but there currently is a big debate and a lot of kind of controversy on the teaching of history, what kind of history gets taught, who teaches it, which are the narratives that are being presented. So how would you see this project as fitting in with, I suppose, a broadly kind of revisionist, in the broadest possible sense, take on British history, because this is a British story as well as an Irish story, as this discussion has made clear?
Well, just on that, in some ways, there's always messages that emerge that are easy to get across and that ones that are hard to get across. And can I just say, using lost lives, in 2007, I was giving a talk about the early years of the Northern Ireland Troubles on the British Joint Intelligence Committee in Oxford to a symposium of largely of old intelligence types. And I was saying the provisional IRA, the IRA in total responsible about 60% of deaths. I said loyalists about 30%. I said, why don't we talk about loyalist terrorism and so on? And one of them, he couldn't bear it. He got so fed up, he interrupted. He said, but the IRA were threatening to invade the mainland. right? And if it isn't on the mainland, it doesn't really matter. And that's the recent troubles he was talking about, in effect, political violence and death. And I do think that what happens in Ireland, be it in Belfast, or be it to a unionist or to a nationalist, to a loyalist or to a Republican, it is another, the island is another place as far as the British policy system and political elite is concerned. I don't see that as a political statement. I see it as a practical problem going back 1,000 years.
But it's quite interesting, isn't it? So that, I mean, so few of the deaths that occurred during the Irish Revolution occur in England or in Scotland or in Wales, and that's quite different from Irish Republican campaigns in the 1880s, again in 1939, and again obviously in the 1970s and the 1980s. The Irish Revolution sort of stands apart in that regard, and that's something that I never really considered to the same extent. I
think it's partly technological in that they're not into bombing so much, right? But bombing, if you like, the technology of bombing and DIY bombing, I think improves in the 20s and 30s. Explosives and things improve. I think that's part of the reason. The IRA GHQ, the Mulcahy papers and others indicate that they did, some people had quite ambitious plans for attacks in Britain, which effectively would have been attacks, involving the civilian population, for example, poisoning water supplies and just crazy sort of what appear crazily indiscriminate actions. So it's not the case entirely that there was a particular restraint after the truce. Rory O'Connor, who was director of whatever engineering, went over to Britain and was urging that far more steps be taken there against strategic targets, but also the IRA had a campaign of intimidating and in one case shooting relatives of people serving in Ireland. So it's a combination perhaps of restraint, but also of opportunity and so on. I don't know what Daithí thinks.
I just very briefly had two small points to that. I think the first is that in terms of sourcing arms, Britain is really important. Yeah. And IRA GHQ do not want to endanger their supplies of precious arms, which they never have enough of. So these are being run from various ports in Britain. So that's a really important consideration. I think the other consideration is that what the Republican side excel at during the War of Independence is propaganda. And in one sense, the more death and destruction, the greater the dislocation of law and order in Ireland, the greater the impact in propaganda terms. And this is exploited brilliantly by the likes of Erskine Childers and others. Art O'Brien, who's a Dáil's representative in London, very, very well connected with the foreign press, very adept at pointing out so-called atrocities across the Irish Sea.
Thank you. I think we've worked both of the authors hard enough. We've put them through their paces. There's been a wonderful set of questions which have come in from our audience. So I'd like to hand back to the ambassador to round off the evening's event.
Well, thank you, Caoimhe and Eunan and Daithí for a really fascinating conversation. I too have the weighty tome, as Caoimhe described it at the beginning, and I have got beyond the opening page. I should tell you that, but on the blurb, Tom Bartlett on it describes it as poignant, sobering, fascinating, and appalling. And I think all of those words are really accurate, because a bit like the famous Lost Lives, which Eunan referred to, David McKittrick's book, which documents all of the fatalities during the most recent troubles, and when you read it, is absolutely heartbreaking about the circumstances in which people were killed, and their life stories and so forth. It's only when you read Lost Lives, and now maybe when you read The Dead of the Irish Revolution, that we realize the enormous human cost of the violence. And I think in terms of, I suppose, any history, the more you immerse yourself, the more contradictions and more complexity that you find. And I think in the case of Irish and British history, complexity and contradictions are our friends. We shouldn't be afraid of them. We shouldn't be afraid of breaking down the meta narratives and acknowledging that things are always more complex than you think. In the end, I think it's the simple narratives are the ones that often divide us. Caoimhe, if I could be permitted just one question, if I could, and before wrapping up, if you wouldn't mind. Later in the year, obviously here in London, we will be looking at the centenary of the negotiation of the treaty. And we had the truce, of course, in July 1921, and the commencement of the treaty negotiations in earnest in October. And between October and December 21, the focus of action was very much in London in terms of those negotiations. So that's something here in the embassy we'll be looking forward to, and we're hoping that by that time in the autumn of this year, we'll be able to have in-person events at the embassy to mark and do something to mark that particular centenary. But I just wanted to ask our distinguished historians whether the one book I remember reading many years ago about a narrative history of the treaty negotiations was, of course, Frank Longford's famous book, Peace by Ordeal. And I don't know, since then, has there been any other kind of narrative history published on the treaty negotiations? So if I was to ask maybe all three of you, if you were to recommend something that one could read now about the treaty negotiations, what would it be?
For the 90th anniversary of the treaty, the National Archives in Dublin put together a fantastic online exhibition with background essays, commentary on aspects of the treaty, and most importantly, images of the actual document. That's a very good place, I think, to start.
There's also, there was a great book published a couple of years ago by Micheál Ó Fartaigh and Liam Weeks, an edited book just called The Treaty. I think Eunan has a piece in there which looks at, I mean, in many ways, it's sort of as much focused on the debates around the treaty as the negotiations themselves. I do know that, you know, somebody who's long overdue another biography, I think, is Erskine Childers, you know, one of these figures through, I mean, he came up earlier in relation to propaganda during the revolution. He was obviously a key figure in the treaty negotiations. He's very important when it comes to the Civil War again. So, you know, perhaps, you know, somebody might decide to write a book on Erskine Childers. I think that would be really helpful. But yeah, that O'Fartaigh and Weeks book is a good one.
If I can come in, I think there's two things. If you want a kind of micro study, an incredibly valuable book of its kind, but we have to be careful, is Tom Jones' Diaries. He was the Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet, and he was delegated to manage the Irish issues generally. But we have to be careful. Jones's diaries are enormous. This is an edited selection, and what you lose by looking at the Irish volume is all the other stuff that's going on at the same time for the British Cabinet, and it's at our cost. The Irish, if we think we're the only issue on the table at any one time, then I'm sure now the cabinet in Britain worry about nothing else but Ireland. But in those days, they had loads of other stuff going on to do with the expansion of empire and things. And the problem with the Jones diaries, it's not the fault of the editor of Jones, is that they're just a selected subset from a huge volume, and he was only the deputy sec. That's the first thing. I would refer, I think, the great book which came out in 2013, the late Ronan Fanning. Now it's a longer view, A Fatal Path. I think that's an outstanding work on the decade coming up to the treaty, just as Deirdre McMahon's study, I think, is unsurpassed of Anglo-Irish relations in the 1930s. So I would say read Fatal Path, dip into Tom Jones, whatever. But Frank Pakenham's book is still, if you want to, in some ways, it might be argued a sympathetic renditioning from somebody who, after all, becomes a British cabinet minister, is still a very good book. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I take careful note of those recommendations, but I just want to thank you all for giving us a fascinating discussion again. We wish you every success with the book. It really is a wonderful edition of scholarship, and I think will serve us well for many years to come. But Thank you, Caoimhe, for moderating the discussion so expertly, and thank you, Daithí, and thank you, Eunan, and it's been a great pleasure, and take care and good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.